Okay, so just to cover then what we're actually going to look at within the session, our course objectives. So the importance of communication skills. Now, obviously, you want to be able to talk about communication skills as part of your interview because it is very important. And part of the reason for that importance is that it goes across absolutely everything that we do in every aspect of business. So, it's something that you have to be able to talk about. We'll talk about the components of communication. So, we'll break it down and look at what's involved and why it's so difficult. Because we tend to think of communication as something that's reasonably, something that we all do, so it's reasonably easy. But I think the longer that you're in a work situation, the more that you realize that actually communication is one of the hardest things to get right. So we'll talk about the components of it. Some of the reasons that it's so difficult is because of the various barriers to good communication, and they're out there. We will, talk about the sort of things that we do ourselves to put barriers in place and some of the ones that are there anyway. And so the sort of things that encourage, I suppose, communication to go wrong because of the barriers that are up there. Communication styles, and it's important to understand that not everyone communicates in the same way. We each have our own style of communication, and it's useful to know what that is and to understand, I suppose, where other people might be coming from in their style of communication, because it's not always going to be the same as yours. So we'll have a look at communication styles. And then improving our communication skills. Obviously, one of the things that you want to be able to do at interview is to talk about how you might have identified some issues and how you might have improved on them. And then at the end of the interview, we'll talk about some of the type of questions that you might get asked around communication at interviews and what the employer is looking for. So my screen is not doing what it normally does, and I'm going to just come out of it and see if I can get it to do better. Just bear with me for a second, folks. Okay, so that's better for me. So I said to you about having pen and paper ready just in a few minutes, but if you could grab, and maybe some of you weren't in at the beginning whenever I said that to you. So just if you have pen and pencil or pencil and paper, pen and paper ready, just for an activity a bit later on. And then there's also an activity that I'm going to do, and it is later on in the session, but I know that some people like to be aware of what's ahead of them. So, Diane, if you can find that link and maybe put that into the chat, it should be called something like the adjective pairs exercise. And it's just a little exercise about communication style, which, as I said, I'm going to cover later on. And I'll give you like 3 minutes to do it in the actual session. But I know some of you, as I said, like to see these things earlier on. And maybe if you're good at multitasking, you can go right ahead and start to do it once that's into the chat there. So, Diana, you okay with that one? Have you found that one okay?
Yeah, that should be it now.
Okay, grand. So as I said, you don't have to do it now. It's there for you to have a look at if you get the chance to do it. But I will give you a few minutes to do it whenever we actually get to it. So I like to start these sessions by explaining why this topic is important when you're planning for interviews. And, whenever you go to an interview, you're likely to be asked, what are your strengths? What are your skills? And chances are you'll probably list communication skills as one of those things that you're good at. And you really should do, because really it's one of those things that employers always want. There's no job that doesn't require communication skills. And communication is one of the most valued skills that employers look for. I think along with positive attitude, self motivation, it's called one of those super skills. Okay, so it's always going to be something that you want to try and improve on, that you want to try and get right. And the thing is that people always say that they have good communication skills. So it's important to understand what that really means, what good communication skills actually are, and to be able to give good examples of how you can demonstrate your communication skills. It might be working within a team, it might be solving a problem, could be presenting skills, it could be customer care, and it might be written skills or it could be verbal skills. The main thing is that you understand what it takes to communicate well and that you have good examples of doing this. And also examples, I think, of when communication has gone wrong, because that's one that they often ask for as well. And because that shows that you understand communication. So of course, if you give an example of when something has gone wrong, you also have to be able to show what you learned from it, what you would do differently next time. Okay. And I give you this as an example of when communication does go wrong. So, as I say, as well as having examples of good communication, it's also really important to recognize lack of clear communication. When there are problems at work, it's almost inevitable that people will say there was a lack of communication. It comes up again and again. When something goes wrong, the first thing that will be blamed often is lack of communication. So it's one of those things that you really do want to try and get right. So now stick with me through this bit. It's probably my more complicated series of slides. So I'm going to show you the components of communication, and hopefully it will also demonstrate to you how easy it is for it all to go wrong. The various different aspects of it, where if one thing breaks down, that's the process kind of ruined. So let's have a look at the process of what actually takes place during communication. It's always a two-way process. That's very important to remember and to understand. So, in order for communication to have taken place, the message has to have been received. Okay, so it's not just about you sending out the message has to have been received as well. And problems arise when people believe that their message has been received in a specific way when it hasn't. So the sender or the speaker encodes the message in that they decide what they want to say and how they want to say it. Obviously, a lot of that is done, unconsciously. We're not aware that we're thinking of what we're going to say. It just tends to come out. We rarely take time to consider exactly how we're going to say something. We do it as we've learned to do it. But of course, if we were preparing for a presentation or an interview or something like that, we would take time to consciously decide how we were going to say something, or at least you'd try to do that anyway. So the speaker decides what they want to say and how they want to say it, whether they do that thinking about it first of all, or whether they do it as, something that they don't have to think about. So the sender transmits the message. And it's important to understand that the message that we transmit is not just the words we use, it's also our tone of voice and our body language and any other sort of visual cues that we will also send a message to the receiver. So it's not just about the words, it's also about all of the other stuff that goes on around that as well. So you can see how it begins to get more complicated as we go on. The receiver then has to decode the message, and there may be many reasons why this message gets decoded in a way that was not the sender's intention. So the receiver may misinterpret the words or the body language. They might filter out parts of the message to fit in with their own preconceived ideas. There may be so many things that are involved. It's lucky if we ever get a message received how we intended it. And believe me, I train in this stuff for many, many years, but I think my husband still tells me that clearly I think he's a mind reader. But then again, I think he has selective hearing. So, I'm just telling you that as it's very hard to get communication right all the time. So there's the information on decoding the message. And there'll be a slide in the PDF at the end of this just to summarize all that for you. So when the receiver has decoded the message and then responds, they basically become the sender. So they will go through the same process of encoding their message, transmitting it, and then feedback is given. And there's the final one in it. So you can see that in a conversation, each party is in a constant process of coding, transmitting, decoding, coding, transmitting, decoding, etc., etc. It is complicated. It's fraught with mistakes. So again, when we say that we are good at communications, we mean that we are able to send out messages that are received in a way that we intended. And of course, this is something that we do automatically without thinking about. For the vast majority of the communication that we do, you do it automatically. Usually it's only when something goes wrong that we have to think about it. So you might be told, that's not what you told me. I thought that you meant something else. You should have told me that. And then when you hear things like that, you know the communication has gone wrong somewhere. So that's the components then of communication. And just moving on then to the barriers. So even if you're trying your best to communicate really well, there can be obstacles in the way. And you have the list of them there, a list of some of them there. So looking at some of the barriers to communication that might prevent you from getting your intended message across to get that through. So physical noise, I mean, obviously, if they can't hear you, then that's a problem. And so that's an obvious barrier, but also things like emotional fears, lack of trust, maybe the mood that the person is in, whether that's the sender or the receiver of the message. Um, if the person, for example, already doesn't trust you, then it's very hard for you to get your message across because barriers will automatically be up. Perception and assumptions. There may already be assumptions made that make it very hard to get new information through. The next one then, language, words, jargon, maybe accents and different cultures. So there could be problems with things like the use of language like jargon, maybe in a particular business environment, for example, maybe professional speak. So every new job that you go into, you probably have to learn the jargon that goes along with it. But even things like someone's accent can be an issue as well. It can just be hard to get the message across sometimes. Lack of clarity then. And whenever I'm trying to design a PowerPoint, and this is probably not the best example of it, but one of the biggest problems for me is cutting out vast amount of information. So usually there's an awful lot more information that I could be putting into these PowerPoints. But the intention is to keep it, simple. And I think that principle of keep it simple is definitely one of the best ways of making your communication successful. So a lot of slides that go into my PowerPoints end up coming out again, to try and keep things as simple and as tight, I suppose, as possible. And I think sometimes that when you say simple, it sounds a bit like dumbing it down because maybe of the level of intelligence of the listener. But it really isn't that at all. It's really about removing distractions, taking out what is not needed so that what is needed is there and is seen, and what is important stands out. And that takes skills, and it also requires you to make an effort and to be conscious of the other person's needs, basically. So the keep it simple and that lack of clarity is very, very important. And obviously one of the things that you could easily talk about at interview as well. The sender's lack of ability then. So, I mean, obviously some people are more skilled at communication than others. So one barrier might be the sender's lack of skill. That won't be an issue for you, of course. After today, you'll be very skilled communicators. But it is something to consider. Not everybody has the same level of communication skill. The receiver is not listening, so that's obviously a barrier. The receiver maybe sometimes just deliberately puts up the barriers and doesn't want to listen for whatever reason that might be. Another thing, another barrier might be not checking for understanding. So you've said what you're going to say and you assume that they have interpreted it in the way that you intended. And the only way that you know how they've received the information is to actually ask them, to check in with them that you're both meaning the same thing. And then just, maybe bad timing. So, for example, imagine you want to talk to a colleague, but they're up to their eyes, they're really under pressure. Maybe they're on the phone trying to get things done. Clearly, that's not a good time to try and get your communication across. So, choosing your moment, choosing the time is important as well. And then finally, there as a barrier is just that being human, having, sometimes, even with the best intentions, we can just lose concentration or we simply forget. So, there might be some content there that would help you to formulate your interview answers around maybe failing to communicate or difficulties with communication. You'll get some terminology there that you can maybe put into your sample answers. Okay, so I thought I'd do a little activity. Does someone, I think I have it on mute, folks, because I'm recording it. So you can only put your questions into the chat. So if anybody wants to do that, go right ahead and do that. So the next little activity then that I want to do is just to demonstrate how hard it can be to communicate. And it's only supposed to be a bit of fun, folks. This is the one that I'd asked you, if you have a pencil and paper ready, then this is when you want to be able to use it. Jan, you might also want to do it as well so that you can give me feedback if you want to. Trying to do this online is not ideal, folks, but I thought I'd give it a go and see how it works. Sometimes we don't know if the communication will work until we actually try it out. But I thought it might be a little bit of fun, so it was worth a try. And if nothing else, it can be an example of how communication can go wrong. So the picture in the slide is how I would actually like to have done this if we were all sitting in a room in real life. I would pair you up and I'd get you to sit back to back, and one of you would describe a drawing or a picture to the other one. And it would be two-way communication. So you would both be able to chat, be able to ask questions and stuff. And I would encourage the person drawing especially to ask questions. But obviously, in our current circumstances, I can't easily do that today. So if anyone is stuck, you can certainly put your questions into the chat or anything. So I'm going to do it differently today. And this time I'm going to be the person that's describing a drawing to you, and you can be the illustrator. So if you just get your pencil and paper ready, I am going to take a couple of minutes just to describe a very simple drawing to you, and um, you just copy it down as best you can. So I just really want you to follow my instructions. Just follow along with it and draw it. And at the end of a couple of minutes, I'll show you what it is that the picture actually was that I was describing to you. And now, before I start, I want to be very clear. It's not a test of anybody's artistic skills. It's a test of my communication skills, I suppose, and your listening skills. But essentially, it's just a little game. So it's just a bit of fun, really, to sort of go through a bit of communication. But I will explain to you later why I'm trying to emphasize here that it is just a bit of fun. Okay, so let's get started. So take your piece of paper and use it portrait style. And that means that the short length of paper is across the top. So we're going to start with 3 shapes. Now, these 3 shapes are stacked one on top of the other, and each one takes up about a third of the page. So working from the top to the bottom. So on the top is an equal-sided triangle. So go ahead and start drawing an equal-sided triangle, taking up about a third of your page. Below that is a circle, about the same size as the triangle. and below that is a square. So inside the triangle, so we're back up to the top again, inside the triangle are 3 5-pointed stars. So 3 5-pointed stars. And now some of you are going, how do I draw a 5-pointed star? Inside the square, you're going to draw a heart, which is almost the full size of the square. And then outside of the square, on either side, so one on each side, is 2 triangles. With the apologize, 2 rectangles. I apologize for that. With the narrow end of it closest to the square. So a rectangle at either side of the square. Inside the circle are some shapes making up a face. So there are 2 circles for the eyes, a triangle for the nose, and an arc, which is a mouth. You can do it smiley or otherwise. And that's it. So, how did you get on? All comments into the chat, please. Anyone who would like to take a photograph and put it into the chat is very welcome to do so, if you're able to do that. Oh,
How's
over,
mine?
over a little bit in front of your face, Diane, so as we can see it a wee bit more covered. Not bad at all.
I'm not sure about the rectangles at the bottom. I got a bit confused.
Yeah, I realized that I went wrong there as well. So thanks for that. All right, so I'm going to show you how very close Diane was to it. And I have to say, I didn't warn Diane about this either. So she was completely new to it, the same as you. So there's my picture. This is what I was describing or trying to describe to you. Hopefully, some of you will have got pretty close to it. There'll probably be, some different interpretations of this drawing because people will pick up things differently. It'd be very interesting to see or to hear if there was anything particularly different. And I suppose the thing is, until I actually show you the drawing, you don't actually know if you've got close to it or not. So my communication with you is entirely limited until we can check for understanding. And of course, that checking for understanding is really important because, we don't know either if I've communicated it to you well or if you'd understood it from me as well. So I also tried to make it very clear that this was just a game. And I say that because I have used this or a similar exercise, not the same drawing, a similar exercise in real life, not with students, I have to add. And some people have become quite annoyed doing it because sometimes communication can cause a lot of frustration and anger. I hope that wasn't the case today. I did try to say this is only for a bit of fun, but I absolutely have witnessed before people getting very, very annoyed and irritated. And I suppose that's one of the things that I wanted to express to you earlier is that lack of communication can cause such difficulties as well. So it's really important to try and get the communication right. So for the people who are drawing the picture, and as I said, I've seen people become so frustrated that they got really angry with the person that was describing it. I've seen someone get stuck in maybe a tiny detail at the beginning and not move beyond it so that they never really get the picture drawn at all. And I've seen lots of people not understand and maybe just, if you're doing it as a group exercise, just copy whatever the person beside them has done. And that's fine because it is only a bit of fun. But if you translate that into a sort of work environment, if you don't understand something, do you just go along with whatever the other person's doing? Because you've no idea if they've understood it either. You've no idea if what they're doing is correct or not. So just think about it in terms of, removing it from the game, the fun end of things, and into the actual workplace and your communications and stuff. And for the person doing the describing, now remember, I have had time to prepare how I was going to describe it. And I wrote it down so that I could just read it out to you. And even at that, I still managed to get it wrong and say triangles instead of rectangles. And I've deliberately made it as simple as I can. But imagine if I had never seen that picture before and had only 2 minutes to describe it to you. So I'm very likely to get tongue tied and maybe not be able to think of the way to describe it, think of the best way that I would like to describe it. I'm very likely to not be very methodical about it. I'm maybe likely to skip out things. I'm just maybe panic about the time slipping away, especially if you're told you've only got 1 or 2 minutes to do it. But the biggest challenge is that generally people do not ask questions. When they don't understand, they just put their interpretation of it on and, rather than checking, they don't ask questions. And obviously, in today's circumstances, you weren't really able to do that. But in a real life situation, it should be about two ways communication, and it should be if there's something that you didn't understand, you ask the question. Okay, so it really doesn't matter to today, obviously, but in real life, it could matter very much. And another problem is that the communicator doesn't check with the listener. So I didn't really check in with you. And I think that with communication, we all tend to think that the problem is always with someone else. They didn't listen, they didn't pay attention, and we tend not to think, oh, I didn't communicate that very well. So I think the starting block with communication is always to look at yourself and examine how you communicated something, not how you think you communicated it, but how you actually communicated it and why it might have come across in a different way to the one that you intended. And the final note there is choosing the best method of communication. So now, clearly, what I wanted to do was to describe something to you verbally. When I do this live, I would ask the describer to put their hands behind their back because the first thing that people do when they try to describe a drawing and they can't maybe get the right words for it is they start drawing the shape in the air with their finger. And that's not the point of the exercise because it's a verbal communications exercise. But clearly, if I really wanted to communicate this drawing to you, then the easiest thing to do would be to show you the actual picture. So my choice of communication would be to use visual communication and then maybe add to that as well to talk it through. But to show you what it is that I'm trying to describe. And that's obviously one of the most important things, the most important points in terms of communication is to think about the best way to get your message across. What is the actual best format that I can use to get my message across? Any questions or comments or likes or dislikes on that activity, you are welcome to put them into the chat, folks. Okay, so I'm going to move on and look a little bit at nonverbal communication. So we've talked a bit there about the verbal. I also mentioned that there was more to it than that, that we also have to include things like the tone of voice and your body language as well. This is the Morabian formula, and it's very old research, I suppose, and there is some research to refute it. So I don't want to get into too much detail on the formula here, but ignoring the percentages that goes with this formula. I firmly believe that when you communicate with people, we need to be aware of our tone of voice, the words that we use, and our body language as well, our non-verbals. So, for example, if I say, I'm not angry while I'm banging the table, you will tend to believe that, in fact, I am angry. I think a very obvious one is someone shouting, I am calm, when they've been asked to calm down. So, you're going to believe the non-verbals over the verbals in those sort of instances. When we're giving a presentation, for example, we don't want to appear nervous because we know that that impacts on the message that we're trying to get across as well. So all of these things add up to how we communicate, and it would be wrong to just concentrate on the words that we use, although they are extremely important. And most of the time, we tend to think about our body language. Um, well, we don't tend to think about our body language unless it is a specific situation. Maybe, for example, an interview when you're told to, sit up straight and give good eye contact and things like that. You also need to consider it if you're having, for example, a difficult conversation with a colleague, wanting to show confidence, if you're maybe just given instructions, wanting to show empathy. So, it is something that we have to consider, but maybe not something that we consciously consider very often. But certainly when you're talking about communications, something that you have to think about. And I don't think the body language is something to get very hung up on. It's generally something that we tend to do fairly naturally. I don't think that it's important to learn what every gesture means because, there are too many exceptions and you have to look at the overall picture anyway. So, what is important is that we know that body language is important, that we are aware of it, and that we pay attention to it. But there's no, unless you're someone who wants to avidly study body language, there's no point in learning what every little expression means. It'll mean something different in a different context. Okay, so I'm going to move on to communication style. And I said that I would give you a little exercise on this. And for this, I'm using Herman's whole brain thinking. He began by trying to find out what made people creative. And he realized that basically people who have preferences for how they think, um, it makes a difference to how they communicate as well. So people think in different ways and they communicate in different ways. Some people have very strong preferences, and some are more balanced across the four thinking styles that he put forward. So that was the adjectives um, exercise that I'd said to you, Diane. If you could maybe put that into the chat again, but I'm going to put it up on the screen here now anyway. So I just want to give you the opportunity to find out what your thinking style is if you haven't already done this. So this was the link that I think Dan put into the chat for you. So some of you might have already started it, but essentially there are 24 pairs of words here. For each pair, you just choose the word that you think is most like you or the word that you prefer. And each word is written in a color: yellow, red, green, or blue, and you just add up the words that you chose in that particular color. So if you're not entirely sure what each word means, don't worry, just go with the one that you prefer. I think out of all of those, just for some explanation, quantitative and synthesizer, I would probably say either data or patterns. And I'm just going to put my timer on for 3 minutes, and hopefully most of you will get it done in that time. When you get it done, if you could please put a thumbs up or something in the chat so that we have an idea that people are actually being able to finish it. And I don't need your results for the session. You don't have to get it done in this session by any means. You can take it away, do it later. It just might be more interesting for you if you know which one of these thinking styles you prefer at the moment. So you can finish it later. Don't think too hard about it. Do try and be quick. You really just want to put a tally against the number. So I'm going to put my timer on for 3 minutes. Folks, don't forget to put into the chat if you're finished, just put in the thumbs up or something. So I see a few folks. You don't have to give me your answers. I see a few folks have finished, and I really can't wait any longer, folks, because it's going to be a very boring interview, those last 3 minutes especially. Um, so I'll move on, but you can continue to do this, obviously, and you can finish it afterwards as well. So if you've got your 4 colors and you've got a number against each of those colors, then you'll be able to use that tally. So when you have your tally, you could plot it across the 4 quadrants of the whole brain thinking. But for now, you really just need to know, have a rough idea of where your biggest scores are. So what do those 4 colors mean? And I'm going to tell you right now. So the blue quadrant is our more analytical thinker. They're all about the facts. They want their information to be brief, to be clear and precise, and they're all about the critical analysis. If your highest score then is yellow, then you are more experimental in your thinking. You look for the big picture or the overview. You tend to be imaginative and conceptual. Our green quadrant then, which is the practical, process-driven thinker who wants the details, needs to follow the rules and procedures, and wants information to be thorough and tends not to go off on a tangent. So we'll stay on topic. And finally, the red colour. And this style of thinking is concerned with people's feelings and with values. They're likely to communicate using metaphors, stories, and examples. And I must say, whenever I was going over this earlier, I was thinking of Professor Jonathan Van Tam and thinking he was big into metaphors. He probably is someone with a preference for red. Oh, Dan says very accurate results for you. Um, so you will have your own preferred style of communication. But that does not mean that you can't flex across those other styles. So, for example, if I knew that maybe a customer was asking for the facts and figures around a product, then they probably are not interested in the story behind how it all came about. But perhaps another customer with a red people thinking style might be more interested in what customer reactions are to the product, for example. So when I described the drawing before, I quite methodically broke it all down into shapes. And I tried to give you proportions, and I even told you what way to turn your page, portrait style. Now, can you see that if I had a different thinking style, I might start by saying, okay, I'm going to ask you to draw a picture of a person. And this person is made up of different shapes. So I might have started with the big picture, and maybe I wouldn't have been, too concerned with the proportions. If I was a red people oriented thinker, I might say, draw a cartoon figure with a big smile and a big heart. So just those different styles might mean that even doing one particular thing, you might do it in a totally different way to another person. So if you looked at that picture and afterwards you thought that you would have described it entirely differently, then chances are it is because you have a different communication style to me. So if people all have different thinking preferences, can you see how their communication will also be very different? How Red might get very bored with a detailed analysis of something when what they're interested in is how is it going to make people feel. So if you were communicating to a group and you didn't know what their thinking preferences are, you might try and balance the information by, giving a little bit of everything, I suppose, perhaps putting the detail into a handout for those that might want more detail. Um, I mean, if you give me a page with a lot of statistics and numbers on it, I'm probably not going to look at them that carefully, but our blue thinkers probably would. So hopefully that will give you some idea of your communication style. And again, you can talk about how your style is essentially, but it's important to talk about balancing it with other styles to get your message across fully. Being flexible in your communication style. So when we're talking about communication style, it's important to remember that it is not just about how we communicate that is important, but how others communicate to us as well. So if you have a particularly strong preference for one of those four quadrants, rather than a more balanced style across the quadrants, listening to someone else with a different style might prove quite challenging to you. And obviously, the same is true for people listening to you. And this communication is, not just about how you communicate verbally, but also in writing as well. So a person's communication style and their sort of thinking preference will come across not just in the words that they speak and in verbal communication, but also in their writing as well. So you might notice it coming up whenever you start to see how friends do it differently. So we might see the blues as cold and calculating, because they're all about the numbers. We might see the yellows as a bit unfocused or heads in the clouds. And the greens, we might see them as bossy because it is all about the rules and the procedures and a bit of nitpicking. And our reds can be seen as oversensitive and a bit emotional. So you can see differences in people's thinking by how they respond to ideas, the type of questions that they ask, even sometimes how their workspace is organized, when they send out emails, how they describe things, and of course, how they relate to people. And remember that if we're only willing to communicate in one way, then we are inevitably going to leave some people behind in our communications. So if you want to get through to the most people, then you need to flex your communication style. So something to consider for you. Now, I want to talk a little bit about listening. And often, whenever people talk about communication skills, they forget about listening. And listening is one of the biggest communication skills. So don't forget to mention that if you're, discussing communication skills at interview, don't forget to mention listening. Try to think of an example of a time when you used your listening skills, maybe to solve a problem, maybe to avoid a mistake or to rectify a mistake. If you're involved with any sort of voluntary work or teamwork where listening is a priority, then make sure to use those examples. Customer care is useful for any industry because you always have internal or external customers. So listening with regards to customer care, can be a very good example. Working with colleagues, also another good example. Have a look at the summary here of active listening. Be attentive, the first one there. Be attentive. Give the person your full attention. Ask open ended rather than closed questions. Ask probing questions, both to show interest and to find out more. And, I know that this is about listening, but questioning is part of listening. Request clarification. Have that check in. Paraphrase. So, just a short summing up to make sure that you're correct in your thinking. Be attuned to and reflect feelings. So notice people's body language and try to understand and empathize with how they're feeling. Being able to hold a silence at an appropriate time is also a very powerful form of listening and of communication. So giving the person time and space in the conversation to say more. And finally, summarize to make sure that you're clear and have taken on board everything. So, again, some key phrases there if you want to be able to answer questions about listening at interview. Obviously, if you're going for a job as a counselor or something like that, you're going to need more than this about listening. But for most communication questions, that will cover you for listening. So, I'm just going to do a little roundup then of some thoughts on communication. Remember that everyone says they have good communication skills, but you have to know that communication is hard to get right. Communication is a two-way process. It's important in every job and in all aspects of life. Getting it wrong can cause mistakes and frustration. And one that I haven't mentioned so far, I think, is don't make assumptions, because that's definitely where communication can fall down. Okay, folks, so any questions before we move on to um, looking at interview answers? I seem to have missed my thing again. I don't know what you're seeing on screen now, folks, but okay, so effective storytelling. So just to sort of move on then to looking at interviews and the things that you want to be able to get across at interviews. Let me see, I've lost my thing for that, so I'll just use this. So interview preparation, and I always include this in these employability skill sessions because it is really very important. It's also a good time saver for you folks to be able to sort of plan how you answer your questions. It's also a very good way of getting across the clear communication to an interviewer. And you have to remember that quite often interviewers have been sitting listening to the same sort of answers to maybe 10, 20, 30 people. So it's important that you try and make your answers as clear and concise as you can. So one of the ways that we encourage you to do that is to use the STAR technique for effectively answering your interview questions. So basically, you want to be able to tell the interviewer your story by putting your answer into context for them, and this is a good way of doing it. So when you're formulating your answer for your interview, try and follow this STAR technique. It makes your answers clear and it makes them logical, and it means that you're getting across the main points that you need to. So start by listening to the question. Think of the example that you're going to use. Hopefully you'll have already prepared something similar to it. But even if if you haven't prepared something and you're having to think on your feet, frame your answer into situation, task, action, and result or results. Describe the event or the situation that you were in. Explain the task that you had to complete. What were the challenges involved in it? Describe the specific actions that you personally took to complete the task. So you might, talk about your team, but you should also say what you personally did. And then finish with the results. So what was the results of your actions? Were there benefits? Were there savings? What was the impact? PowerPoint seems to be all over the place at the moment. So I also just wanted to let you know about a software package that's available to you at the moment on the careers website, and Diane has a link to put it into the chat there for me as well. It's called Shortlister. It's basically an online package where you can go on and practice interview skills. So you choose a company that you want to have an interview with, usually about 5 or 6 questions. The one thing I would say is that if you register for an interview, you've only got 3 days to complete it. So, it's a really good way of being able to practice. You're not dealing with any actual people. it's just computer system. And you do also get feedback. So again, the feedback just comes to you through the computer system too. So it's a good way, and a way that you don't have to be nervous about as well. Okay. And then finally, at the interview. So the sort of questions that you might get asked. Tell us about a time when you used written communication to successfully influence someone. How did you go about structuring your writing? Now, I haven't specifically covered written communications, but much of what we've talked about will still apply to, the written word. So knowing your audience, using appropriate language and jargon, giving the level of detail required. If you know what their thinking style is, then all the better. But otherwise, even talking about balancing it across those quadrants as well. Talk about being clear, about being concise, courteous, giving the benefits, etc. Next one, then demonstrate how you vary your communication approach according to the audience that you're addressing. And this would not only be about communication style, but also things like maybe the age of the audience, the level of knowledge that they have. So, presentation that you give to experts would not be the same one that you would give to a primary school, though it could easily be around the same topic. So, it could be if there are different levels of knowledge in the group, depending on what the purpose of the talk is. Is it about giving information? Is it about entertaining? That sort of thing. Tell us about a situation where your communication skills made a difference to a situation. So, if you can think of how you were able to explain a situation, maybe even calm a situation, show the benefits, maybe encourage others to participate, that kind of thing. Tell us about a situation when you failed to communicate appropriately. And as I said, I think it's really good to have an example of, an incident when communication went wrong, basically. It's good to have something prepared there, because otherwise that's the sort of question that you maybe reveal things you don't want to. So having an actual example that you're willing to talk about at interview is good. But you also want to be able to talk about it in terms of, I recognize that could have been done better. Here's what I would do differently this time round. Describe a situation where you had to explain something complex to a colleague or a client. Which problems did you encounter and how did you deal with them? So it might be appropriate there to talk about communication styles, perhaps about the method of communication. So maybe a visual might be helpful. It might be helpful to do the communication face to face rather than by an email or over the phone. So some things to consider there. Remember to put your answers into that STAR framework. Position your response in a positive way, even if the change was not entirely successful or if it was uncomfortable for you. I'm just going to stop recording there. And if anybody wants to ask any questions,